Hello, thanks for dropping by the Writing Center Hub. I am Dr. Rochelle Isaac and I'm going to guide you through a session on integrating sources. Thinking about sources. For our purposes, think of sources as materials from which we will gather information for our papers. They're primary and secondary sources, and primary sources provide first-hand accounts of events or particular time periods, while secondary sources analyze, interpret, or evaluate those primary sources, right? So I guess it's useful to think about them in proximity or closeness to the original event. So some examples of primary sources would include diaries, interviews, biographies, speeches, and some examples of secondary sources would be journal articles, literary criticism, newspapers, that kind of thing. Using sources. So, sources can be utilized for a variety of purposes, right? We need to present facts or statistics. We want to provide background information. We want to provide evidence to support our claims or arguments. We want to use them as authority or to enhance our credibility. We want to provide examples and illustrations, or maybe we want to address opposing viewpoints. These are some of the reasons why we should use sources. Now, a tip for every source, determine why and how to incorporate it into your paper. You should not include sources if you do not have a specific reason for using them. Tip number two, every source used must be cited in a format specified by your instructor or discipline, typically MLA or APA. A source's role in your paper. When you begin to write your paper, you need to think about how you're going to use your source. Begin by thinking about the role that source played in your research process. For instance, if a source provided you with context for a particular problem or issue, then it can probably do the same thing for your reader. If a source provided you with evidence that supports your claim, then you may want to share that evidence with your reader and so forth. If a source made an argument that made you think about your own position, and made you refine your position, then you may want to use that source to provide a counterpoint for what you're saying. Of course, in that case, you must ultimately suggest why you're thinking your position is the better one. In order to use a source effectively, you must integrate it into your argument in a way that makes it clear to your reader that your ideas came from that source, but that source is also adding to your own thinking. In other words, you're explaining what the source is doing in your paper. Each source you use in a paper has to be there for a reason. It has to have a specific purpose, and you should make it plain to your audience. So, how do we integrate a source into our paper? Well, I'm going to suggest three ways: summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. Please note that all three methods of incorporating sources will require citations, okay? Both in text and, of course, included on your works cited sheet. So, how do we integrate a source into our paper? We're going to look at three ways to incorporate sources today: summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. And tip, please note that all three methods of incorporating sources require citations. So you need both in-text citations and full citation entries in your works cited list. So let's look at summary. A summary should concisely capture the key points of a text. You need to summarize a source when the entire text is relevant to the discussion. So, for instance, if you're asked to write an analysis based upon an article, you would need to provide your readers with an overview of the entire source so that they can understand what you're saying. Paraphrasing. Paraphrasing requires restating relevant ideas from a source in your own words, but also requires that you credit the author. Signal phrases will help you. Signal phrases like according to, as so and so notes, as so and so explains will help you credit the author. So, when using information from a journal article, for instance, paraphrasing is often appropriate. Quoting. Quotes are used to emphasize and support a point you've made or when the original wording of the text is important to your discussion. So if you're attempting to deconstruct or break down word choice in a literary analysis, for instance, a direct quote would be necessary. Um, and don't forget to enclose all your direct quotes in quotation marks. I suggest using the Sequoia method to help you format your quotes. Um, the SE part means to set up the quotation. As Smith argues, as so and so explains, then you have the QUO. That's where you quote accurately. You are presenting the text away from its original context, so it's important that you present it accurately. And then the third part, the IA, this is the intelligent assessment. This is where you perform your analysis. This is where you tell us why the wording is important. Do not leave it up to the reader to decide. Tell them how you see the quote. So don't forget to signal explicitly when you're bringing in another source. You do that by using a signal phrase, the author, and a verb. Isaac contends, Isaac argues, Isaac admits, Isaac contends, Isaac concludes. You have tons of verbs to vary your word choice. And this is an important point. Indicate why your sources are credible. An easy way to do that is with your introductory phrases, right? Instead of simply saying Cox states, for instance, you may want to say Professor of Library and Information Science, William Cox. Or instead of simply saying Joseph explained, you'd say Albert Joseph, Professor of Sociology, or psychologist Sherry Turkle. That provides some additional context for your reader to understand why that source is credible. As I'm sure you already know, each paragraph requires a topic sentence, a controlling idea, which helps the audience understand the purpose of that paragraph. But when we deal with source material, it's important to have a topic sentence that also considers and contextualizes that information being presented from your source. This way, the reader gets a sense of how that source material fits into the topic being discussed. Of course, somewhere after the topic sentence, at some point, you will need to introduce the source. Um, and that's where you may want to identify any important information about the source material, such as the author or pertinent background information. Now we're going to use and cite the source. So now that the information has been set up properly with the topic sentence, you provided a brief introduction, it is time to actually use the source material. Set it up the way you've planned, and do not forget to include an in-text citation. So let's talk about analysis. This is something that students struggle with. So it's not enough to simply put the source material into your paper. You need to do that last step, the analysis. So let's go back to the Sequoia method. The third step there is the IA, the intelligent assessment. And this is really what they're asking us to do, analysis. In other words, you must share your conclusions after having examined and interpreted the material, the events at hand. This is what needs to be shared, and this is your analysis. Readers need to understand why the sources were chosen, how the material supports your claims, and the relevance of that information. We've come to the end of the PowerPoint, and I hope you have a better understanding of how to integrate sources into your paper. Thank you for stopping by.